welcome to Season 10, Episode 8 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I'm Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course, reading the Thomas Sowell Reader, going through some of the best essays from Thomas Sowell, this time finishing up the section on political issues with just a couple more articles here. You're looking very confused at your setup there.
No, I'm doing fine. I'm sorry I distracted you with I was trying to get the volume
It's like
set
you
up.
kept leaning towards your camera, so I was just seeing your forehead get closer and closer on the screen. It was great.
Well,
But
that and the sun is shining in at an angle. So if I get close to
mm,
the screen, as the viewer can see,
yeah, as everybody can see on this audio-only podcast.
makes me look
Um,
spooky.
But yeah, we only have two articles to go over, but one of them's pretty long. The first is on Liberty Reconsidered, and then the next is on Karl Marx, trying to give an accurate description of his life according to Thomas Sowell.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts before we get into these?
When I was a young man, about your age, I guess it's a little bit younger even. When I first read On Liberty, I thought, wow, this is really brilliant free speech, but it kind of, and now that years later, or it's personal liberty, that type of thing, but
Hmm.
it kind of isn't in a very real way. Those are my initial thoughts, and
Yeah.
I think as far as the Karl Marx, I think Sowell's description of him and his life is actually generous.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking today, I should probably, maybe I shouldn't care as much or care so much about his personal life because, you know, uh, when I consider other leaders, like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, I mean,
Mm,
they had their flaws. They had slaves for crying out loud, but I still respect some of the things that they said and they believed. In fact, the vast majority of what they said is certainly George Washington. Um, and so maybe I should just not care as much about
mm,
Marx's personal life being a sponge on the wealthy
yeah.
while espousing class warfare stuff. It's just so weird,
Hmm.
but we can get to that.
Yeah, that's
What are
fair.
your initial thoughts about these two really influential thinkers that wrote in England? I mean,
Yeah.
seminal works, really.
Yeah.
Uh,
I
Still
mean,
powerful.
very similar to yours. I'm definitely not a fan of John Stuart Mill, because he was definitely a big utilitarian. Was a
Yeah,
lot of what his philosophy boiled down to, and of course he changed his mind so often throughout the course of his life. You read one thing from early on, and it'll say something completely different than what he wrote, 30 years later or something like that. But On Liberty, was very influential in that sort of idea. But I think a lot of people have that idea, and that's really what Thomas Sowell is sort of criticizing in this first essay. I guess we're kind of just getting into this here, but a lot of people view it as like a very libertarian, everybody do whatever you want sort of thing. But that's not really what he's talking about at all. Everybody thinks of it as kind of just like government should stay out of everybody's business, but a lot of the time he's not even talking about the government. Is Sowell's big
right,
point throughout.
right. He's really just talking about societal pressures
Hmm.
for the most part, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he says, let's just start talking about this one. He says, what then is the subject of On Liberty? Mill says in the first paragraph of that essay that its subject is, quote, the nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. And then Sowell says society, not government. And then he goes into talking, he gives a longer quote about, the tyranny of the majority is really the biggest problem. Not so much that the government's going to come in and use its military power or things like that to take your stuff, but rather the tyranny of the people around you that are going to sort of be the most direct influences on you and the most direct restrictions of your liberty.
Correct.
I guess you don't have any thoughts on that?
Not too much. I mean, I think you summarized it pretty well. Yeah, I don't know.
Fair enough. But then he goes on to say that there's sort of a different part to On Liberty here, where he says the central principle elaborated on Liberty is asymmetrical in yet another way. It becomes clearer, especially in the later parts of On Liberty, that Mill's special concern is with the effects of public opinion and customs on the intellectual elite. Customs are made for customary circumstances and customary characters, he says. Essentially, that exceptional people, sort of, the elite of the society should be exempt from public pressure. So it's not
Yeah,
so much that the ordinary man is going to be bogged down with the weight of everybody else's opinions. It's really that the elite who are more responsible for society shouldn't have to worry so much about the court of a public opinion in a way. He says that's
right.
that's what Mill's arguing for.
Yeah, and kind of anti democratic, and at its core, it's this as you mentioned, elitism, and that's where I have a problem with them. He talks about is like this patrician attitude, like there are
Hmm.
certain people of higher worth, higher capabilities, and it's very English,
Mm.
and it's a temperament, and sometimes I sympathize with them, especially when I'm feeling really arrogant. And as long as I'm one of them, one of the those people that should be given special accommodation, and not have the pressure from the majority.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, I mean, especially in America, you have mobs, you have rush to judgment and all that kind of stuff. But when people are given a chance to deliberate on serious issues, they don't come away too wrong most of the time. Like so is this in civil, like when you're in litigation with the legal system, there's this fear of the runaway jury. The
Mm.
jury is just going to get carried away. They're going to run away and they're going to do something crazy. Um, but I found that the vast majority of them don't. That you the jury system really does work on the
Hmm.
vast majority of times. Now, when you have a really politicized environment like Washington, D.C. for the January 6th people, who hopefully would be pardoned by the time this program is over, done recording.
Yeah, I guess we should mention we're recording this on January 20th, 2025. Trump was just sworn into office a few
Yeah,
hours ago.
inauguration day, and of course Biden pardoned his family today,
Yeah.
pardoned the January 6th uh, committee members,
And Fauci, I think,
pardoned,
right?
yeah, Fauci and General Milley. Those pardons for Fauci and his family start, I think certainly start 2014 to
Mm.
the present. Unprecedented is too light a word for something like that, um, but anyway, I guess I can go on a rant on that, but I'm getting a little tired. But also he pardoned all of the people, the Capitol Police, and all the other officers,
Hmm.
and I think everybody else that testified in the January 6th committee, and there was perjury there. That's been shown. Certain really high-profile police officers claimed they were hurt, and they were not, and people went to prison because of that.
Yeah.
And but what that really does is, and anyway, back to my original point, which is the runaway juries. I think the Washington D.C. Um, local society or culture was so anti-Trump and anti-Republican, anti-January 6th because the media did not report that fairly, et cetera, um, that the mob was dangerous to what would have been a lead opinion about what's truth under those circumstances. So I acknowledge the risk for a well-functioning society of the people that are deep thinkers shouldn't have to worry about being ostracized or
Yeah.
punished for having other think. I get that, but but I don't find that really a compelling argument
Hmm.
separate from government action.
Yeah.
I think it only applies when the government is involved. But if society says you're a creep and a weirdo, then you just got to deal with it,
Yeah.
and I don't know that there's a really an effective argument against that other than fight for your beliefs,
Yeah.
I guess.
'Cause, I mean, I think that really, you know, kind of, I don't know, proves him wrong necessarily, but I mean, that's a good example of when the elite, quote unquote, goes really wrong. With sort of the elite in our country, where it's, very much, left leaning, and a lot of them have been so insulated from public opinion because a lot of the media is so left leaning, will cover for them, left, right, and center from anything that they come across. That it's just like, yeah, they're pretty much free to do whatever they want, but clearly, our society hasn't necessarily benefited from it. They're not coming up with the great ideas that are propelling us forward like he would like for them to.
Yeah,
I mean, a lot of this in a way, I mean, it reminded me a lot of Plato's Republic. We need to have
right.
this sort of guardian class that's above everybody else and things like that. Which in some ways, is compelling. If you have just the best people in a society making all the decisions, well, of course, that sounds like a great system. But then it's a question of how you actually get the best people to be in charge. And,
Right.
clearly we don't have that system right now.
Well, in like um, in my line of work, as a small town lawyer, but I deal with big city people too. You know, I interact with people that are really intellectual and sophisticated or whatever, much more sophisticated or intellectual than I am. But then I'll be dealing with some local rube, uh, and or rubes, plural, lots of them, you
Hmm.
know, and quite often those local rubes have a lot more sense and are a lot better read and better informed than a lot of the so-called elites. And so it's like, okay, well, how do you classify who are these high thinkers? You know, you go out to a farm, you know, especially if somebody is an actual farmer, has cattle or animals, they have a much better understanding of, well, it's almost like they have a better understanding of the gospels, to put it bluntly, because they understand life and they understand loss and hard work and all that, and then spirituality and growth and creation. It's
Yeah.
really it's fascinating to talk to somebody who's just a down to earth, but intelligent. You know, I'm not saying every farmer is a genius, because there's a lot of dumbasses out there in all categories. Pardon my language, but I hate this. Well, we're going to have this as Sowell is talks about these anointed
Hmm.
people, that will, you know, be separate and to have these special privileges and protections. And like a good example of why we shouldn't have that is Donald Trump. So like, I don't want to overstate it, um, but for example, um, you know, he gave that the famous Charlottesville speech
Hmm.
about there are good people on both sides. And of course, he's talking about on both sides of the Confederate statues issue. You know, some
Hmm.
people think it's a matter of history, it should be up there and blah blah blah, but it was interpreted to say, good people on both sides of the white racism side. Well, there's good white racists, you know, but that's not what he was saying, of course, at all. And so he's condemned for that, as wrong thinking. So I'm using that as an example because he stuck to his guns. So that I never meant that. I never said that. And his supporters kept beating that. And in the last couple months, like maybe September through now, I don't know how many times I've seen an interview with somebody who is left of center or a leftist, that media story was their red pill for the
Hmm.
truth.
Hmm.
So that's why I think you shouldn't have protections for people who are other thinkers, or who, you know, who are outliers, or skeptics, or, you know, the people we all agree, oh, those people are crazy. That's wrong. We have to condemn them, because if they stick to their guns, eventually, you know, they don't need protections. They just need to be able to not have the government shut them down. Because yeah, who was it? Was it Sam Altman? I'm trying to remember. It's one of these guys that's like one of these super wealthy guys,
Hmm.
that came out. I don't even know if he came out in favor. Well, like I forget who the guy is, but he was in the All In podcast this last weekend. And he's some super wealthy uh,
Sure.
LinkedIn guy, you know,
Yeah.
one of those guys who became a billionaire in that PayPal era. And he said that was his red pill moment. You know, he started thinking, well, this doesn't seem right, and that doesn't seem right. And then somebody said, well, did you know that was just a lie about Trump? He's like, what do you mean? Well, watch the whole speech, or watch 2 minutes of it rather
Yeah.
than the 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And he said,
Literally either sentence, either side of the
of
phrase that's
what the
cut
quote
out,
was.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, that my argument is, of course, I could re-argue that. I don't know if anybody who listens to this, or if anybody listens to this, but want to argue that point. But I think my point is, like, there's no reason to say some people should be exempt from social
Yeah.
pressure, because I think the only way you can enforce that is by having government pressure against social pressure. I
Yeah.
mean, how do you do that? And I don't think there's a need to, as long as the government's not involved. And eventually, if it's true, society will figure it out.
Yeah.
And I'm optimistic on that
Yes.
point.
Well, good.
Still,
It's
so,
an optimistic day. Well,
yeah.
well, speaking of Trump, I think, he ties really well into all of this because in his inauguration speech, the first speech he just gave after being sworn in was all about common sense, and about sort of, a return to normalcy was the big theme throughout it. Your point about the farmers, really plays into that. It's like, the average person on the street is going to know things, about gender and things like that. That it's like, well, I don't need a 15-page, article to back up my point on this. I can look at people and see what they are. But it's like the,
Yeah.
the elite, the academic elite and whatever, well, we have all of these sources, we have all these citations and whatever. Well, that's not going to trump common sense any day of the week. If it's just that self-evidently true, people are just going to pick up on it. And so it's like that sort of thing. The common sense of people will usually prevail.
Yeah. There was a viral video I saw it was a couple weeks ago. It was a trans person, showing off her cat. I guess on like maybe some sort of video conferencing type thing or whatever,
Sure.
video sharing thing. And the person on the other side said, "Oh, is it a boy or a girl?" And she said, "Oh, it's a girl." And the other person said, "How do you know?" Completely befuddled the trans person. Oh, hmm. Um, it was like you see the wheels turning inside her head. So I mean, like you're not going to be able to screw with a farmer's head about sex and gender and all that kind of
Mhm.
stuff because there's an obvious difference there.
Yeah.
Practical, when you're breeding animals, but yeah. Anyway, so I think I've kind of beat that dead horse,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yes. Any other
Uh,
thoughts on liberty, or should we move on to the Marx the man?
Um, yeah, I think we can just move on to Marx the Man. I mean,
Sure.
like I said, I used to think that that John Stuart Mill's On Liberty was like some eye-opening experience as far as free speech and that kind of stuff. But it kind of is a different flavor to it when you
Mhm.
reread it after so many years. And
Yeah.
maybe you smarter than I was when I first read it.
But yeah, moving on to Marx, he kind of just takes his life section by section here.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much into the detail we want to get, but he mentions, his family was essentially like an upper middle class family. Marx's parents, they were fairly well off, and had some siblings and things like that. Born in Germany.
Can I ask you? I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, sure.
So, what do you think and like I kind of made an argument against really caring about a person's personal life. But what do you think about because his personal life argues against his philosophy so
Hmm.
much?
Yeah.
Because as you just said you're about to show that he was a son of wealthy merchants basically, and he was well to do, and he just blew through any money that he was handed to from his
Hmm.
parents, and he was never seemed to really work a day in his life. He was an academic, but he didn't really study or do
Yeah.
anything other than think about how he can overthrow the government and protest against capitalism, although he never participated in capitalism because he never worked. So, I mean, and he was a horrible person, didn't support his family, seemed to almost like torture his wife with his sloth and lack of resources. And they just piss away. Anytime they have money, they just piss it away, and but they did it together, I guess.
Yeah.
And I thought his soul doesn't mention. I thought one of his children starved to death. I
Hmm.
almost was almost certain of that, but I'd have to look that up again. Meaning Marx. But having said all that, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, should we just not even should we care about his personal life when addressing his political philosophy?
Yeah. I mean, it depends, right? Because, I'm a pretty big proponent of not, canceling everybody who doesn't, meet our standards of the day and things like that. 'Cause that's just ridiculous. But when you have somebody like Marx with his whole life's work is like so like specifically oriented towards one thing. And all of his writings are very polemic. It's not just like theorizing about things. It's not just saying, here's a possibility, but so much of it is like you need to live by this, and therefore humanity will like reach its peak. And then he doesn't do any of the things that he's talking about. I think there's definitely cause for criticism there. Right. I mean, it's things like, the founding fathers, okay, they own slaves, right? Not a good thing, but that wasn't like that doesn't completely discredit everything that they've ever said. But with Marx, with all of his stuff that's so focused on wealth and redistribution and stuff like that, for him to just spend so freely and not actually work for anything, I think that really undermines a lot of the points that he tries to make.
Yeah, and I guess I'm struggling with it a little bit because I want to be consistent,
Yeah.
neurological, and how I want to be fair in how I view historical figures, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. But I'm not going to be. I don't think so. So, but I think I think of Marx, and maybe it's a little bit more emotional than intellectual. Marx the same way I look at the environmental cultists today, where like well John Kerry or Al Gore, where they say we have to save the earth, we have to cut carbon emissions, but then they have like three mansions and private jets and they go gallivanting all across the world. Um, at these conferences that do nothing but pad their ego and maybe their
Right.
pocketbook.
Yeah.
And so I think in some level that shows that they aren't serious with their proposals. But at the same time, if you have a minister, it's kind of like do as I say, not as I do, which there's some logic to that.
Hmm.
But I guess if Jesus was out carousing and murdering people, I don't think I'd be a Christian,
Yeah.
even though everything keep everything else the same. But it turns out he was a serial killer, and that's why he was kind of going about Jerusalem from town to town because he was killing people and going from place to place. I mean, like they
Hmm.
say that was proven. Well, I certainly wouldn't believe he was the son of God,
Right.
and I wouldn't believe in his philosophy. So
And I
I
think
guess maybe I
that's
just convince myself to judge people by their personal life. What do
Oh,
you
there you
think?
go. Well, I mean, I think that does play into Marx because Marxism is such a religious thing now, right? Because he's not
Yeah,
writing, just about economic theory. The whole Marxian, scale is really like a very religious philosophical thing that somehow we
yeah,
will inherently become better humans if we move past this economic system. Like it's about human nature at its core. And for
yeah.
him to not live out any of it, I think it does correlate. If the leading figure of your religion didn't follow any of the religious tenets that he's proposing, you wouldn't follow that religion. I think that's exactly what's happening here, is because Marxism, I mean, especially now with in the couple hundred years that have passed, has become such a religious thing that you have to hold him by that same standard.
That's a good point. And I guess with Jesus, he was the message too. He
Hmm.
was the word. So maybe that's not a good example, but like maybe the founding fathers may be a better example because he talked about individual liberty, and we're all every man has are endowed by their creator, certain rights. And now, having said that, it doesn't. I don't think they ever advocated for slavery.
Hmm.
Otherwise, they had slaves.
Hmm.
And then when they died, I think in their wills they freed their slaves, if I remember correctly, for the most part. Um, so maybe I should be harder on them about how they espouse the true value of liberty while holding slaves, because I just can't get past, we're just starting to talk about, his early life was, he was
Hmm.
a son of a not super wealthy, but well enough off parents that they sent him to college, and he was evidently a bright student, but
Hmm.
didn't work hard.
Yeah.
And then his early career, he was just aimlessly wandering, and he ended up going to quote journalism,
Hmm.
which is really just a liberal newspaper, but he seemed to not get along with anybody
Yeah.
and couldn't really make a go of that as far as generating revenue for himself or his family.
Hmm.
Uh, he was never really a successful academic. His collaboration with Engels, who was the son of really wealthy people, and Engels essentially had, he eventually worked for his parents' business.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody really established whether he actually did work, but he did show up.
Yeah.
Like was it one of those like mafia jobs where it's there's no show jobs and there's a show job that you just show up and you play cards or whatever and you get
Hmm.
paid. Maybe his was more work than that, but then he basically subsidized Marx,
Yeah.
um, and as they were working, so to
Yeah.
speak, on their writings.
Yeah, one of the things that I found most interesting was, in this section that he titles, collaboration with Engels, and this is kind of a
Yeah,
recurring theme, but they would sort of infiltrate these already existing organizations, and then through like careful planning, they would just completely shift them, towards, being aligned with Marx and Engels' ideas. He says that there's a radical organization in London called the League of the Just, and it was in the process of reorganization to become the Communist League. And so there were several people who needed to write up this credo. And so one of those people submitted a draft to Engels, who then just completely changed a lot of what this dude had written, and that is what became the Communist Manifesto. And so by placing
Yeah.
themselves like in these prominent positions and just controlling like a few people within these organizations, they could completely shift a lot of the beliefs of these organizations into to what they wanted it to be, which, is one of those things that I think is again so ironic because communism is supposed to be about, it's from the people and things like that, and they'll all rise up once they realize the truth. But so many times throughout his own life, when he's trying to start these movements, he's not doing it democratically at all. He's not really convincing people that it's so. He's placing himself like on these boards that are writing up the drafts or the manifestos and stuff, and just ensuring that he sort of bullies his ideas through sort
Yeah.
of manipulating the body there, which is very, very,
Yeah.
very interesting.
And it's still consistent to what Marxists do to this
Yeah,
day.
yeah,
Like they infiltrate a government agency and take it over. They infiltrate like Disney, and which had a creative arm, and now and they what was the one author or political commentator says, liberals will grab an entity, hollow it out, and then wear its skin as a costume as they destroy it, and pervert it to its opposite, the opposite of its original goals, and that includes foundations and all that. So it's funny how they did that then, and Marxists are still doing that as a tactic today,
yeah.
and they're undermining the institutions, and that's why
Hmm.
there's so little faith in American institutions now because they've all been taken over, and the original purpose have been undermined, similar to what Marx was doing with these journals, these um, newspapers and different commie groups or
Hmm.
social justice groups of the day.
Yeah. And then, of course, in 1849, they had gone to England, and that's where they're going to spend the rest of their lives because they're essentially exiled from
Right.
Germany. And is there that you were kind of talking about earlier, where Marx especially is just very, very destitute. He says, in 1850, they moved into the slums of London where they spent most of the next 20 years. They didn't have enough money to pay the rent, buy groceries. They dodged creditors, were often kicked out. And yeah, he says they had three children die amid the squalor, including one for whom there was no money for a burial until a gift was received for that purpose. And throughout this
Yeah.
whole period, Marx is not getting a job, right? He's spending a lot of his time writing or really avoiding writing, as he kind of talks about later, because he's supposed to be working on Das Kapital, the big, sum of all of his work. And then there's another part a little later on where Engels realizes that he just hadn't been doing anything that he was doing, even just in writing this book. And he's like, you just haven't even finished hardly any of it over these many years that you've said that you've been working on. You can't even do that, um,
Yeah.
which is just absurd.
Yeah, and he was just such a corrupt individual, and it's been a long time since I tried to plow through Das Kapital and some of these writings, and I don't know if I ever got through it. I do remember forcing myself through Mein Kampf. What a mess that thing is, and and but this is the same kind of. I don't know. I don't know if you've ever read it, but
No, I haven't.
it's almost unreadable. It's really it's just a bear.
Yeah.
Yeah, I finally got through Dostoevsky. I don't know if I mentioned that to you. I got through that I guess, weeks ago, and yeah, that was work at the end. And then I'm like, what the hell is the point of this stupid thing? It's 800 and something pages. Uh, I don't know. Uh, I guess I'm just not a deep enough thinker for these Russian and German literature and
Yeah.
writers. I don't know.
Oh, that's fair.
But
Um,
I think it's I think it is very it's certainly compelling story about how
mhm.
um, his life was such a refutation of his political views. I
Yeah.
mean, that system, the Marxist or the communist system, first of all, he's in the wrong class. He's acting like he's in the working class, but he's not.
Hmm.
He's the affluent, lazy class. Um, so he was born in affluence, but he was only poor for out of choice. He 100% choice. It could have been middle class or upper middle class had he applied himself to any reasonable degree. Um, in the capitalist structure that existed, certainly
Yeah.
he certainly had those opportunities, and he just pissed on them. And no economic system will work if there's any significant portion of the population that lives as Marx lived.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you have a freeloader problem, and he was a freeloader. He's
Hmm.
100% in his entire life. He freeloaded off of everybody around him.
Yeah.
Uh, Never supported himself, and he doesn't ever address that, as far as I know, in any of his writings or his political philosophy. And I'm sure he just never even thought of himself as that. Like, he's so egotistical, it seems, that he just thought he was above
Yeah.
the rules that apply to everybody else.
And
But he was
that's
just so fixated on whatever his political agenda was. He couldn't see around the fact that it's kind of like, who was it that, I guess it was Jordan Peterson, but it was also a military, I think, general that gave a famous not valedictorian, a commencement speech that said, if you want to, achieve something in your life, make your bed. It was a really good
mm-hmm.
speech about, like, you take care of your immediate responsibilities, and they go from there.
Yeah.
And that's what Jordan Peterson's big argument was in the 10 rules for life, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And that's a real antidote to this kind of toxic class warfare philosophy, because so many people get tied up in what's wrong with society. They don't do anything to improve their own
Hmm.
lives and the lives of the people around them. And that's how really we all make change. It's like, we all can't be the leader. I mean, we're all, you can't, you
Yeah.
only have so many chiefs. You gotta have a lot of Indians. Most of us are just Indians, and we should just be helping out the tribe. Um, and if too many people are out there talking about how, the chief sucks, and this tribal council sucks, and you're
Hmm.
out there protesting the tribal, I mean, you're not planting any corn, you're not killing any buffalo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but that chief, he's corrupt. And we need to have a new system.
Hmm.
Maybe system should first be plant some corn. We're gonna starve.
That's a good point. But
Yeah,
um, I think the egotism really shows in his discussion on the First International. This was
yeah,
really interesting because there's a group, the International Working Men's Association. And again, just like earlier in his life, he was in the process of reorganizing, and Marx managed to get himself on the council that was responsible for essentially drafting the rules. He says he had taken no active part in the organization before, was only belatedly brought into the discussions, and was mentioned last on the list of participants. But he was able to get the group bogged down in interminable discussions. And he says, on a pretext, Marx's own word, I altered the whole preamble, threw out the Declaration of Principles, and finally replaced the 40 rules with 10. He then maneuvered some Marxists into key positions in the new organization, and by 1867 was writing to Engels of, quote, this powerful machinery in our hands, and of his own influence, quote, from behind the scenes. And then what had ended up happening is when they didn't become communist enough for Marx, then somebody else challenged him for leadership. This Russian Bakunin, and he managed to get him expelled. And he had the headquarters of the International Working Men's Association transferred to the United States. Again under the pretense, oh, we'll be safe from other people trying to come in and co-opt the organization. But of course, he knew that the organization would completely dissolve if it was moved because he just didn't have enough people there in the United States. So it was either Marx rules or nobody rules, and he completely dismantled the whole organization because he was challenged by somebody else. So he reworks this entire thing again, completely undemocratically, completely behind the scenes, and then when he doesn't get his way, he essentially throws a fit and just destroys the whole thing,
yeah,
which is ridiculous. But again, it's sort of exactly how a lot of communist governments work anyway,
yeah, or don't work.
or don't
Yeah,
work. Yeah,
and
exactly.
and and they're all they all end up being, or they all are, little totalitarians. Like, Lenin was, I don't think in the same era, but I read a biography of Lenin a few months ago, and he was involved in the international. And he went to Germany, and I think he went to a conference in England and maybe in France. I mean, and try to fight for, it's like a power struggle and all this and that, and for a period of time he was completely on the outs with everybody. I think he had like
Yeah.
one friend in the world, and then his mother and his sister and a wife that he was kind of separated from because he was banished or whatever.
Yeah.
But similar, but Lenin was always a killer,
Mm.
so he was I think a different animal than Marx, but they both had a similar temperament in that um, it was either, they either got power or they would destroy it.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
exactly.
but it's just so, I mean, the philosophy, it's like and I know so many people have have really looked into this, and so many philosophers and religious thinkers have looked into Marxism and described it better than I can ever do. But it really is kind of a philosophy of envy
Mm,
and um, and it's really evil. I mean,
yeah,
it is it's soul. It's not um, it's not just um, a lack of morality, which of course that's the heart of the philosophy is that there is no morality, but it's really anti-morality, in
mm,
my opinion. It's just so anti-society in its own really weird, perverse way, just
yeah.
destructive
Well, I mean, yeah, I
of
mean that
community.
goes back to what I was talking about earlier. I mean, it very much is a religion
Yeah,
in itself, because it's like if we just take these right economic steps, because I mean it talks, like I mentioned earlier, it talks so much
yeah,
about human nature, where it's like if we just do these right things, then human nature will be perfected and we can all live in peace. But that's a terrible lie, right? It's just completely glossing over the fact that some people will be greedy. Some people, like Marx himself and like all these communist leaders, will get themselves into these organizations and plant them for their own purposes, and things like that. And so it's like if you set up these structures where the state takes control of all of these things, then you're going to get bad people running it. You can't just say, well, everybody's just going to be good at that point. It's a
right.
terrible line. It just leads to death. If people
Yeah.
do support it and they hand over all this power to the government, to the state, then people are going to die.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yes.
It's wild that there's so many people that have read this or read of it and think it's a good idea. It's just it really is fascinating to me
Hmm.
and perplexing. I don't understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the end of the chapter, there's not too much else to discuss here, but of course he mentions, he really languished in writing volumes 2 and 3 of Capital, especially,
Yeah.
and Engels didn't
Right.
even realize. And then once it was published, he made no money on it because nobody was reading it at the time. Really, the only fame he had at that point in his life, he says his greatest notoriety came as a defender of the bloody activities of the Paris Commune of 1871. And so that's where he rose to most prominence because he defended them. And it really wasn't until after his death that he came to any prominence and people started to believe his ideas really
Yeah.
firmly. And then he ends the chapter with a bunch of contemporary assessments, which is really just a bunch of people talking about how awful he was to deal with, which I
Yes.
thought was a pretty funny way to end this article here. And the descriptions are pretty great in there. But yeah, it's just so many people who tried to work with him just couldn't because he
Yeah.
was so insufferable.
Yes. He's a bad person.
Yes. Yeah, I like this quote. Marx liked to glare at anyone who challenged his conclusions and say, quote, "I will annihilate you,"
Yeah.
which is, yeah, I mean that's fitting for his theories there.
I think we've all met some people like that. They're just really negative personalities. They want their way or they will hurt you.
Yeah,
Uh, and it's just like, oh gosh, all right.
yeah, exactly, exactly. All right. Well, do you have any other thoughts on these uh these articles here?
No, thankfully the Marxists in our federal government will hopefully soon be cast out by
Hopefully.
by the rather almost comically weird group of people that are going to be part of the Trump administration. Eclectic, I guess.
Yes.
Because I was looking at the dais. I don't know if you saw any of the inauguration. You look at the dais and I'm like, all these, oh, it's a weird group of
Hmm.
people. Like you got Elon Musk, you got Zuckerberg, which are kind of similar but really different.
Yeah.
Bezos, and I think it was his wife that was next to him.
I don't
And
know.
then you've got what's his face, Hegseth,
Hmm.
defense secretary, and then I think I saw Roseanne Barr then up there.
Dana White was up there. I know
Oh, was he? Okay,
he
he
was
was.
he was in the crowd at least. I saw him,
Okay.
stand up at one point behind everybody. Uh,
Yes, and there's just a weird and
yeah.
RFK Jr.
Hmm.
It was like Super Friends, but I don't know that they're super, but like the Super Friends are a weird group of
Yeah.
people and or maybe Legion of Doom. I don't know,
Yeah.
bad guys.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. I don't know if you saw, but evidently he's planning on signing his executive orders in the Capital One arena. They brought
Yeah,
the presidential signing desk for him to sign everything in front of the whole crowd.
I was just looking at that before we started. Stephen Miller. Do you know who Stephen Miller is?
Of
He's his.
the Stephen Miller band?
No,
Oh,
no, no.
oh,
He was a special advisor to the president last
right,
time. He was American First Legal,
right, right.
and he gave a speech yesterday at the rally. and he's like the immigration hawk
Right.
of immigration hawks of the first Trump administration. And so he was there with the initial signings, which I saw earlier today. So after he got sworn in, they have an official signing where he's formally nominating the cabinet. He's formally appointing the interim people before
Mm,
they get. And there was, and then he also signed the one that said, that there's two genders and
hmm.
something else about the um, um, border. I think there's four special ones. And so Stephen Miller is saying, well, here's this one about these people. And then he signs it, and they've got actually the congressional leadership there. So I
Mm,
think Chuck Schumer is there and Jeffries. And so there's a little table set up. They're going to have the parade indoors at that arena.
yeah.
And so this huge dais, and Stephen Miller is out there by himself, and he's putting those like binders, and he's got post-it notes on each one of them, and he's pulling off the post-it notes, like put them in order. It's just Stephen Miller on the stage by himself while this Marine band is playing in front of him. And
Oh,
I
that's
can
really
tell,
funny.
I think there's like 14,000 people staring at Stephen Miller messing with these binders before the
Wow.
president showed up to sign them. So who knows what's in those?
That's pretty great.
Should be pretty entertaining for the next couple of days.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any other thoughts? I think next time we're going to be going into the legal issues section.
Yes. I might have some interest in these.
Yes, hopefully.
I'm a lawyer.
That's correct. All right. Well, this has been season 10, episode 8 of Unlimited Opinions. You can, of course, follow us at ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. I have been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.